I want to thank everyone, Baba and Alyssa, for a wonderful, filling lunch. Snoring will not be tolerated. The reading of the paper, and mercifully I've been asked to read while standing, so if I fall asleep, you can just laugh. Compassion, dialogue, and pluralism. You cannot be too gentle, too kind. Shun even to appear harsh in your treatment of each other. Joy, radiance joy, streams from the face of him who gives and kindles joy in the heart of him who receives. All condemnation is from the devil. Never condemn each other. We condemn others only because we shun knowing ourselves. When we gaze at our own failings, we see such a swamp that nothing in another can equal it. That is why we turn away and make much of the faults of others. Instead of condemning others, strive to reach inner peace, keep silent, refrain from judgment. Saint Seraphim of Sarov, the great Russian saint, and starets, or spiritual elder. One of the most extensive discussions and descriptions of compassion in Jewish, Hebrew, and Greek and Christian literature is found in the Testament of Zebulon that is contained in an early pseudo-epigraphical text, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, which I assume is in your Kindle reader under bedtime reading. It purports to be a set of deathbed testaments by the 12 sons of Jacob, a key patriarch in the Old Testament. It dates from the early centuries BCE to the early centuries of the Christian era. It reveals both Jewish and Christian sources. Versions of the Testament exist in Hebrew and Greek. The Testament of Zebulon treats the theme of mercy and compassion, and the Greek word here is eusplanchnia. This particular testament offers one of the most extended descriptions in ancient Jewish and early Christian literature of what compassion involves. Moreover, the vocabulary used to discuss compassion is very close to the vocabulary found in the Synoptic Gospels and in the various epistles in the New Testament, and it is not found for the most part in the Greek translation of the Old Testament or the Septuagint. Prior to making an attempt to connect compassion with dialogue in a pluralistic setting, I ask you to bear with me as I will spend much of the presentation providing a characterization, very loosely phenomenological, of compassion and its core features. Since we hear this term in connected terms such as mercy, pity, sympathy, and empathy in a variety of different and conflicting ways, that as Socrates more than once reminds us, we need to define or characterize our terms before we proceed to talk or arguing about them. And in particular, I want to note a distinction between compassion and pity that I make. The English terms are all over the map, and the corresponding Greek terms also are often ambiguous. I don't know Hebrew well enough to know that about the Hebrew terms. But what in particular, at the core of this is distinguishing compassion and pity. Compassion involves, this is footnote 1, compassion involves and pity may involve action to assist others. But in pity, the actions are self-directed. One assists another for one's own sake, while compassion is fundamentally other-directed. Second, pity is exemplified in condescending pity. Pity is perfectly compatible with viewing others in terms of an array of invidious distinctions that marginalize them. Compassion, as I will develop it, fundamentally affirms others in the fullness of their humanity. Pity and compassion both involve dealing with our own vulnerability to suffering. Pity responds to such vulnerability primarily through fear. Compassion accepts vulnerability as a central feature of the human condition. So, from the Testament of Zebulon concerning mercy and compassion. And now, my children, I bid you to keep the commands of the Lord and show mercy to your neighbor and have compassion towards all, not only to humans, but also towards animals without reason. I was the first who made a boat to sail upon the sea, for the Lord gave me understanding and wisdom therein. Sailing it along the shores, I caught fish for my father's house, and being moved by compassion, I gave of my fish to every person who was a stranger. And if someone was a stranger or sick or aged, I boiled the fish and dressed them well, and offered them to all people as every person had need, sunagon and sumpaskon, and I'll talk about those in a minute. Do you therefore, my children, from what God gives you, be moved with compassion to show mercy, adiakritos, another term we'll talk about, to all people. Give to every person with a good heart, and if for a time you have nothing to give to the person who is in need, supasketa, with him with bowels of mercy. Other versions have bowels of compassion. Three core characteristics and features of compassion are indicated by the words sunagon, sumpaskon, and the related supathia and adikritos. The Greek word sunagon usually has a sense of bringing people together. One might think that Zebulon is bringing people together, perhaps to organize a meal program for the purpose of feeding them. But sunagon here seems to be connected with the distinctive use of the term in Matthew 25:32, the parable of the Last Judgment, where Christ says to the sheep, those who are righteous or just, to the sheep, those who are righteous or just, Christ says that when he was a Savior, when he was a stranger, they took him in and welcomed him. Here's the verb, sunegagete, while the goats did not. The sheep came towards him, the goats did not. Sunagon, in this sense, is an openness to others, in which one comes towards others in a gesture of support. Sunagon here is essentially hospitality, in the literal sense of philoxenia, a love of the stranger, although Zebulon extends it to everyone. Zebulon's compassion is fundamentally a movement towards others in a gesture of friendship and hospitality that emerges from bowels or a heart that, even if grieving over the suffering of others, are relaxed or open to others. If this seems a bit fanciful, then simply recall the relaxed, effective openness you might feel towards a good friend or someone you seek to comfort, with the constricted, visceral recoiling or aggressiveness towards those whom you fear or despise. The Dalai Lama, I would note, observes that his compassion towards others always involves greeting every person as if he or she were an old friend. Compassion is not just an internal feeling or mental gesture. It is more fundamentally an attunement, a stimmung, to borrow from Heidegger, to others. It discloses others to us in a way that we go out towards or draw near to them. But in what way? Here we have a significant clue from the word sumpaskon. In using this word, Zebulon indicates that he is literally suffering with those to whom he not only gives but prepares fish. This term is related to sympathia. And on footnote 8, sympathia, interestingly, is the Greek counterpart for our word compassion. The English compassion goes back to the Latin compassio, which was first used by Tertullian in the 3rd century to talk about the way in which the soul and the body were to be united with one another and befriend one another. And it's used in a number of ancient texts, in fact, to translate sympathia. And in a number of Greek liturgical texts, sympathia, when it occurs, is often translated in English as compassion. Thank you. I got a cold before I came, and my voice seems to have disappeared. In any event, the term is related to sympathia, but it has the explicit sense of subjecting oneself to the suffering of others, in the sense of bearing with them while assisting them. It also means that Zebulon does not flee or retreat from others. Clearly, Zebulon is not undertaking the suffering of others by making himself hungry and depriving himself of food, but he's bearing with them in the sense that he both turns away from what he has been doing, catching fish, to attend to others by cooking and providing food. It is also open and responsive to their suffering and distress. In this suffering with them, he creates, if only for a brief moment, some sense of community or fellowship, koinonia, or to use a modern term, a sense of solidarity. So we have, I think, two basic features of being moved by compassion. An attunement of openness to others in which one comes towards people, and a willingness to bear or suffer with them, not retreating or fleeing from them and rejecting them. or simply passing them by. Compassion, then, refers to effective and embodied conditions that move individuals out beyond themselves towards others in a welcoming, open-handed gesture of hospitality and service. Compassion as an attunement is not just action, but a way of viewing others, and indeed everyone, even animals, for Zebulon. For Zebulon, compassion and mercy are to be extended to all people, adiakritos. The sense of the Greek here is without making an examination or without making distinctions. And just a quick word. Without making distinction in the case of compassion doesn't mean I level everybody down to a kind of cipher that are all equal to one another. I can't very well render assistance to others if I don't take note of the differences and the concreteness of their situation. So whatever the adiakritos means here without distinctions, it's not leveling things down and eliminating into particularity. The sense of the Greek compassion involves being open to others without going through an initial mental examination of whether they are somehow at fault or whether they are good or bad. St. Theodoros, the great ascetic, links this attitude of welcoming others without examination with the hospitality of Abraham in the Old Testament. Accepting the task of hospitality, the patriarch used to sit at the entrance of his tent, inviting all who passed by, and his table was laden for all comers, including the non-believers and foreigners, without discrimination. I suggest that this appeal to an openness to others without examination is best understood against the background of the many passions and thoughts by which we sort people out both socially and individually according to various invidious distinctions or according to the range of self-aggrandizing passions that we experience, such as hatred, envy, and greed. In particular, for my immediate purposes, the many effective cognitive states by which people are stigmatized, denigrated, or basically put down contain what we might call a priori accusations. Stigmatization and denigration effectively a priori accuse people of being fundamentally defective and unworthy of inclusion in any truly human relationship. They are at best children, the legacy of colonialism, for example, towards many countries in the world, and at worst fundamentally defective threats to others in the community, what we see with racism, sexism, xenophobia, and so forth. You can hear the delegitimizing accusations in the language people use to denigrate others. Just check out what passes as much public discourse in the United States as present. A sclerotic heart or bowels drives us away from others. In several texts, St. John Chrysostom links the lack of sympathy, asupatheia, and the lack of compassion, asplagnia, with inhumanity or lack of humanity. One of the basic terms used to describe compassion in the New Testament, in the early literature like the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, and throughout the Greek Byzantine tradition, is eusplanchnia. It is often translated simply as compassion, but also as tender compassion, tender mercy, and so forth. Eusplanchnia, however, originates and derives from eusplagna, that is literally good bowels, calm or tender bowels, or better, well-ordered bowels. Bowels are heart open to others and willing to bear with them. At its core, as in the parable of the Good Samaritan, compassion is central to being a neighbor, plesion, that is, one who draws near, is open to others and draws near to others to affirm their humanity, their equality of honor, or primary equality of rights, terms from Gregory the theologian, and thus to act on their behalf. One final observation. Compassion is often linked with awareness in response to the actual suffering of others. Zebulon seems to present it this way. But in a more fundamental sense, compassion for others, all others, arises out of it as directed to the vulnerability that marks all created things as created. The Hebrew term for compassion, racham, and I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly, is connected with rahem, womb, has the sense of a woman's womb-like love for her child. Isaiah captures the sense of this compassion when the Lord says, "Can a woman forget her nursing child and have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget, but I will not forget you." That connection between compassion and womb, by the way, is utterly lost in the Septuagint and in any English translation. The fetus does not necessarily suffer in the womb. It is, however, profoundly vulnerable and unable to sustain itself. So too with neonates and other young children. In this case, we can have compassion for them as a commitment to bear with them and for them because they are vulnerable. Without our assistance, they cannot survive. The vulnerability of the fetus or young child is also profoundly connected to the vulnerability that parents face, whatever their privileged status. St. Gregory the theologian brings out this connection between compassion and vulnerability in his oration on the love of the poor and the afflicted. He was especially critical of those elites who refused to render assistance to lepers because they refused to acknowledge the weakness, the asthenia of human nature, the fact that we are fundamentally vulnerable to all kinds of suffering and affliction. This weakness is rooted in our very nature as created beings. So Gregory writes, our very nature has legislated this compassion, teaching us by our equality and weakness that we must couple virtue with the love of our fellows. I will draw on this point at the end of the presentation in discussing the vulnerability that belongs to the life of faith and reason. So compassion and dialogue. Dialogue with others, both interreligious dialogue and dialogue between people of various faith traditions and those who do not affirm such traditions, the secular world, is not just a manner of intellectual engagement among interlocutors. It is very easy for strictly intellectual engagement to be shaped or misshaped by all kinds of underlying visceral passions which serve to marginalize, denigrate, or disvalue other worldviews and forms of life. These sorts of affective stances and their cognitive counterparts serve to undermine any genuine pluralism or constrain it within narrow parameters. One only think of the many illustrious folks who have proclaimed the rational equality of all human beings, only without remorse to oppress, sell, exploit, or murder those who did not share their racial, social, ethnic, or other identity. In my own academic experience, the often painful history that many philosophy departments have undergone and still undergo in trying to move beyond the confines of the traditional Western European Anglophone canon has illustrated the ways in which a variety of gender, racial, ethnic, and other biases, affective and cognitive, implicit and explicit, have often hampered the ability of the philosophical profession to be genuinely accepting of forms of philosophy that do not fit the mold of Western European Anglophone traditions and of the persons who represent those traditions. Philosophy still is predominantly white male. It's not the only discipline that's like that, by the way. Genuine openness and philosophical dialogue in a global context requires what is often called the approach of a comparative philosophy, in which interlocutors have to honestly face their own biases, assumptions, affective stances towards others for honest, fruitful efforts at mutual understanding. Compassion can and should play a vital role in such dialogue because it provides a holistic orientation of an open, non-accusatory hospitality towards others. I suggest that the same sort of compassionate attunement to others is crucial for a fruitful dialogue between members of different faith traditions and those who do not share and often reject the value of any faith tradition. This sort of attunement may seem irrelevant in dialogue within an academic setting. From the standpoint of the methodologies of nearly all academic disciplines, people's faith perspectives and commitments are basically irrelevant. Relative to those methodologies, we usually practice not just don't ask, don't tell, but who cares, in regards to our faith and very often our moral commitments. The formal development of knowledge within a discipline may not vary with or depend upon the particular moral and religious worldviews of those within the disciplines, but surely at an existential or social level, it is important how human beings individually and collectively integrate the pursuit of academic knowledge into their lives and worldviews, faith-based or otherwise, which is the entire point of a liberal education. Genuine dialogue with others, after all, involves sharing our lives and narratives with each other, how we make sense of our lives, where we find the center of life, that provides meaning, the nature and source of our moral commitments, and so forth. I have often engaged in open, rich interaction in conversation with people from a variety of religious traditions within a campus ministry setting. But the utter indifference and even resistance to this sort of dialogue on the academic side of the university, even at a place like Marquette, produces a kind of sterility and disconnectedness from a truly holistic pursuit of knowledge that aims to be pluralistic. Yet creating a richer institutional space in which such dialogue can take place in an explicitly pluralistic setting depends on what one means by pluralism. Pluralism seems to have a relativistic meaning and a non-relativistic meaning. On the relativistic meaning, faith traditions and the array of non-religious or secular traditions are simply varying human social constructions, none of which have any particular overarching grasp of truth. As long as no traditions or individuals try to assert themselves over others or poison the well with intolerance, people from various traditions and non-religious traditions can dialogue with each other with the recognition that there really are no fundamental differences over conflicting truth or values. But such an approach to pluralism, in my own view, eviscerates any real truth to religious faith. My own thoughts, the witness of many men and women who have been martyrs for their own faith, is ultimately pointless. On the non-relativistic meaning, pluralism recognizes that there are genuine disagreements and even fundamental incompatibilities between different faith traditions and their secular counterparts. Dialogue between traditions is easily threatened, since people may always approach each other traditions in guarded ways and with suspicion and even hostility, since those traditions may ultimately undermine the truth and value of their own tradition. Dialogue can be reduced to forms of polemical persuasion and apologetics, both faith-based and secular in nature. These forms of persuasions and apologetics can even be said to be moved by compassion, since one is trying to bring people outside one's tradition from error or partial truth to truth, from a misguided way of living to a correct way of living. But this sort of compassion can easily devolve into a kind of pity for others who do not share or participate in one's faith or secular worldview, and who ultimately challenge the truth of our own faith. Compassion, in contrast to pity, opens us to seek a non-judgmental, non-accusatory engagement with others. This engagement does not mean that we must agree with others or that we must simply capitulate to their demands. It does not mean that we compromise the integrity of our faith, not just as a set of beliefs, but as trust and commitment that ground our relationships to others, the world around us, and what is divine. And compassion in this sense certainly is not sentimentality. In fact, compassion in this sense is ultimately opposed to sentimentality. But compassion does involve bearing with others, supporting and befriending others who do not share and may even reject our own faith and worldview. Compassion for others counters all the sclerotic stances by which we cordon ourselves off from others or seek to diminish them. In contrast to pity, compassion for others is also fully attuned to our own vulnerability and fragility, the doubt and darkness about the truth of one's faith and commitments that has beset many people, and especially those of deep faith. Compassion for others offers dialogue with others, all others, ultimately in a stance of humility and neighborliness. So it ultimately leads us to accept the risk that always attends genuine dialogue, that we may change and turn away from the convictions and commitments that undergird our faith and our worldview. Thank you.
So now, it's open to you for questions. You want to start?
Yeah. I deeply appreciated this because it echoes a lot of what the U.S. Hindu-Catholic dialogue has been coming up with. Homi Bhabha's third space, and then a lot of the fleshing out that was done was based on discussing that compassion, sure, and compassion, when you're talking about the interlocutors of a dialogue, it actually needs to boil down to friendship. Because it's only when you have a friendly relationship with a person that you can go beyond some of these problematic bases that are too disparate to kind of bring together into a whole. So I'm wondering how this would play out, for example, in a place like this, where we are all, well, not all of us are, espousing very, very different, but some of us are espousing very, very different worldviews. Is there something fruitful? And this is a question that our campus ministry department asks quite regularly. Is there something fruitful to be had from interreligious dialogue? I just want to know your take on that.
Well, I think there are two levels. Before I took over again as chair, I was serving for a while in campus ministry. And what was interesting, we had extremely rich discussions about interreligious dialogue. And part of that always was how we went about doing ecumenical services. And there were ways in which we could join in with those. There were opportunities for people to have prayer services where people brought prayer from their own faith traditions, whether Christian or Jewish or otherwise. But when it came to, in the Christian tradition, Eucharistic services, I mean, all of us realized that no matter how fruitful the dialogue was, confessional differences make a difference. I can't walk into a Catholic church and say, by the way, I'd like to be a Catholic and I have communion. And if I walk into a synagogue and say, I think I want to be Jewish. Well, I'm going to have to undergo a process, I'll use the Christian term catechism, and in the process of undergoing that process of catechism, I'm going to have to fundamentally reshape certain beliefs that I have. I can't simply say, today I'm Christian, oh, I'm also Jewish, and that's not going to work out. So at a confessional level, and this is where sort of the rubber hit the road in campus ministry, at a confessional level in certain kinds of services, such as Eucharistic services, it was very clear that not everybody could participate or would participate because of the real differences in the beliefs and practices and commitments in those faith traditions. In an academic sense, who cares? Nobody really talks about, while there are differences between Lutherans and Protestants and Catholics and Jews and Muslims, all of that can get leveled out in terms of a kind of academic dialogue, because nobody is concerned about anybody leaving their own faith tradition and adopting something else. So for me, much of the test of a really important interreligious dialogue is we can gain friendship in the recognition that the risk of this dialogue is that people may leave their own faith tradition and become part of another faith tradition in which they really have to undergo changes in their beliefs and commitments. At an academic level, because it gets leveled down, at one level, the discourse, I don't want to say that it's banal, but it can proceed at a kind of head level in which people can disengage the personal commitments that sustain their own belief. So we can do this all day here at this level. We can walk away and we're intellectual friends, but we really haven't gotten down to the really difficult level if we were to talk about, this is really great, now what kind of an ecumenical service can we plan in which we in some sense worship or pray together? The contours for that, I think, would become a little bit more difficult and would bring out, I think, the integrity and the reality of our own traditions. So it's those two levels, and I never really discovered that until I was on the campus ministry side of things, where these questions look a whole lot different than they do on the academic side. And I noticed a couple of you in your introductions brought that out. Yes?
Thank you very much for this paper. I'm sparking connections, one of which is the difference that you point out between compassion and pity, which is something that's taught a lot in Buddhism. This difference between the compassion is this way and pity is this. So I'm, of course, fascinated by this connection. And you also speak of openness, and to my mind, one can only be open when one is deeply grounded. So you bring up a kind of ambiguity or question here that it's the grounding that allows one to be open to the difference. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
In the Orthodox tradition, there's a wonderful work called the Philokalia. It's a collection of texts that belong to a certain strand within the monastic tradition. And there are sort of two stances towards the passions in that. There's one stance among some of the fathers that view the passions as fundamentally evil. And it's not clear to me how well those guys are connected with their own body. On some of them, it seems to me, would just as soon not have a body. But there's another view that comes out of Maximus the Confessor, where the passions are not inherently evil. They've been twisted by human sin. And the goal of Hesychus' practice is to gain apatheia, not a stoic apathy in which one remains indifference to the world around him, but apathy in the sense that one frees oneself or allows the Holy Spirit to free oneself from all of the self-aggrandizing passions. And those self-aggrandizing passions are not only the passions of greed and so forth, but among that collection of self-aggrandizing passions are the passions by which we find ourselves needing to judge others, to puff ourselves up at other people's expense. We're just beginning the Lenten tradition, and one of the key texts in the Orthodox Church before we get into Lent is the publican and the Pharisee. And the story, the parable that Jesus tells, he tells it about certain people who try to justify themselves before God by denigrating others, by despising others. And sort of the villain of the piece is the Pharisee, who not only tries to make himself righteous before God, but he does it at the expense of the publican. So that tendency to put other people down, I think St. Seraph's right, the tendency to put other people down ultimately comes out of a fear of ourselves. So part of this purification of apatheia is to become relaxed. It's really to have the sense of calm bowels, good bowels, in the sense of being open and creating a space where you're not afraid of the other person. And it's in that space that you can approach others. The other thing I'd want to say that I didn't talk about too much, compassion does not necessarily require empathy. We often assume that it does. First thing to note is empathy is a 19th century German term. There is no term for empathy in English before it was coined by a psychiatrist in the 19th century in German. So if you look through any of the texts in the late ante-Nicene and post-Nicene fathers, I've got the whole collection. You won't find the word empathy in any of those translations. You won't find the word empathy in the translation of any Greek liturgical text into English that I'm familiar with. There is no term in Greek that corresponds to empathy. The term is sympatheia, but sympatheia does not mean empathy. And the reason I want to bring that out is it's a mistake to think that we necessarily can put ourselves in another person's shoes. Examples that I use for my students, because this is an issue for them. What would it mean for me to say that I have empathy or I understand where someone is coming from who's conflicted with their own gender identity, who finds himself in a body like this and yet does not identify as being a man, or conversely, does not identify being a woman, being in a body that is biologically a woman? That's an awfully difficult conflict for people. I don't have a clue what it means to go through that. Does that mean I can't show compassion for them? And I don't think the two are linked. I think compassion may lead one to grow in empathy, but I don't think that it requires empathy. The other problem with empathy is if I can put myself in your shoes, if I know what you're going through, you don't need to speak for yourself. I can speak for you. So part of compassion, it seems to me, is this kind of humility in which, and I'm drawing on what you say, in which I'm opening to let you speak, to listen to you, without the assumption that I already know what it is that you're going through. So compassion, I think, holds off on empathy initially to create a space in which other people can tell their story without my thinking I can tell it for them.
Shabtai, and then...
So, But Ricardo also. Ricardo is dying also.
Ah.
The ability, so the ability to understand and, as you say, have compassion is really very unique ability. You can feel compassion without ever being able to really understand. Let's say the conflict that you spoke about, having a woman's identity within a man's body. Something that you say we men could never, some people could never understand, and yet they can feel compassion. They could listen and they could feel compassion without ever be able to identify it, because they'll never be able to feel it for themselves, to experience it for themselves.
Or out of compassion and listening, an understanding might develop. I think empathy can follow compassion. I don't think it necessarily leads compassion.
But what is the end result of the compassion process?
I think at the end result is, in the case, for example, of somebody who's struggling with gender identity,
Right.
I may listen to them over and over again, but I'm not sure I can ever tell them, I really know what it is you're going
After
through.
speaking.
After speaking to them. There may be something that's ultimately mysterious about another person and the circumstances in which they're going through. And part of my respect for what that person's life is to accept that mystery, that there's something I can sort of circle around it. I may be able to speak to it, I may be able to express it, but there's something about there that may remain radically incommunicable to me that may be understood only by somebody who's going through something similar.
But still you can learn something from them, right? By
Absolutely.
listening to them you can learn something.
Absolutely.
So if I take it back to the dialogue that Dr. Sharan spoke about interreligious dialogue, that we'll take it to not to the academic level, to very down-to-earth level of different practices that don't mean anything to me. Someone has a practice, but I cannot put myself in this practice. I can still learn something from the practice, from the attitude, from the human involvement in this practice.
Yes.
And doing that will benefit person. So compassion, actually, you describe it as a very tremendously interesting learning process, that I can learn things that really transcend me, some kind of transcendental learning.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, I don't think that religious dialogue has to lead in mutual understanding, that we're all on the same page and we all understand what makes each other tick. I'm not sure that that's required for genuine friendship and dialogue.
So it's something almost divine, like you describe compassion as a divine attitude that men can assume.
Well, in the Old and New Testament, the paradigm of compassion is God.
Yes, sure.
We're supposed to reflect that, take that on, but the primary expression of compassion is divine compassion. That's right.
So now we have Wayne and Ricardo. I don't know who was first. And you also watched.
Can I please after this?
Okay, Ryan.
This is so good.
I got you.
Wait,
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just want to be sure I didn't cut in. I enjoyed this. A good paper. Some good ideas. I have a question though. In the life of the church or even society, you have situations in which you have people that are actually sometimes so evil or detrimental or to a person's own life that justice comes in and not compassion, in my view. For example, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where you have the person who was with his father's wife, not even named among the Greeks. And Paul says, I'm not even with you, but I know what needs to be done. Remove him. And he says, and interestingly enough, he says, so that his soul might be saved. So there was a sense of result. Or like in the book of Jude, where you have individuals who come in trying to operate obviously to hurt the church. And there's not a statement of, I don't see that terminology, but a fact of judgment. So how does the issue of compassion in certain contexts work with the fact of dealing with evil in other contexts?
Well, I think compassion is, first of all, what I would call the default orientation and attitude that we have to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting in that little piece from the Dalai Lama where he says, I approach everybody as my friend. He says, you know, the best place to practice compassion is with my enemies. And he says, part of the reason to practice compassion with my enemies is because of the tendency to demonize them. And the problem with when compassion and justice, on one hand, seem to be at odds with one another. Yeah. Right? And there are any number of texts in the Old Testament, this sort of dialogue between compassion and justice. On the other hand, where it looks like compassion is doing something that is beyond what justice requires. Okay? That's sort of a legal sense of mercy. Okay? But there's another sense of compassion as an attitude that underlies any sense of justice. And that sense of compassion is a holistic affirmation of the humanity of another person. And the reason I want to stress that is because the rational affirmation of the other human beings has too often been contaminated in history by all kinds of unspoken affective biases. I mean, the history of the West is just filled with that. So, in the case of those people who are evil, who do things that are manifestly wrong, first of all, compassion is not acquiescence. In fact, part of the name of compassion is to want the well-being of one's enemy, which means for those who do evil, the purpose of compassion is to try to help someone stop doing evil. Now that may require imposing sanctions. Okay. It would be fundamentally, I think, misguided to tell a woman who's being sexually abused to be compassionate towards her abuser by tolerating it. In that case, a woman needs to walk out of that relationship. People need to help her get out of that relationship because it's abusive and it can lead to lethal consequences. The problem, though, is in that dynamic, the moment where justice takes place, the moment compassion folds, and we tend to demonize others. And you can listen to the language sometimes you find in police stories. Scumbag, all of that language that comes in, all of that language is delegitimating language. And it expresses a certain anger towards people. But it also expresses an anger in which it tends to delegitimate them and delegitimate them in ways that we don't have to treat them with the same kind of justice that we do other people. So that while I agree with you, compassion runs up into certain limits, the stance of compassion, this openness to others, this willingness to affirm the humanity of others, is a way of making sure that justice, in fact, remains justice and not vengeance. When compassion fades, justice all too often replaces with vengeance, and human history is faced with people who oppress them, right? Who, instead of being compassionate towards those who have done, which doesn't mean just acquiescing to them, but who demonize them, end up becoming oppressors themselves, or end up wreaking vengeance on those who have oppressed them, and justice is no more satisfied in that case than another. So I think at one level, justice, compassion really is a stance, is a stimulus, is really integral to to justice.
Ricardo.
Okay, that's very interesting what you said right now. There is one rabbi from the at the very end of the 18th century, but he lived actually in the 19th century, which is Rabbi Shmuel David Luzzatto. He wrote a book that he states that there are two main principles in Judaism, and it is compassion and justice. And then he writes a whole book on that and its relationship and how it works. And what he says is very similar to what you just said right now. And I wanted also to just a small comment. There is one entrance of the word empathist in Aristotle on the second chapter of his book on the dreams, although it is not the sense of empathy, it's another completely different sense. What I wanted to ask is the following. In Aristotle, when he uses the word eleos, sometimes it can mean pity, sometimes it means compassion in the same sense of you need to have the other in front of you, you need to suffer with the other in order to have this compassion. It's not in the sense of of pity, but in a sense of compassion, really. But at some point, the word became kind of divided, and as you put here, the use of with good bowels, it started to be a common word for compassion. And I wanted to ask, why do you think this division happened and became so accentuated? If you have ever thought about the...
See, it's interesting when you look at Aristotle in the Rhetoric, and he talks about eleos, right?
Yeah.
In the Christian tradition, if you come
chapter
across
8.
in the Christian tradition, whenever you come across eleos in a text, you translate. First word that comes to mind is mercy. All right. When you read what Aristotle means by eleos, that is to say, the sense of someone who is suffering who doesn't deserve it. Right. At the core of Aristotle's eleos is this calculation. I got to make sure they don't deserve it. If they deserve it, then eleos is inappropriate. But nobody would translate that as mercy. It seems to be a notion of pity. But those terms in the classical Greek tradition, eleos words and iktermon words, come out of a tradition of lamentation. Oikos means basically lamentation. And Aristotle is working particularly out of the tradition of the tragedies, where there's this tendency to create these dramas that provoke this, what I can only call as a kind of sympathetic, in the bad sense, pained response, to excite this pained response in others, in which other people sort of lament and grieve over things. So the notion of lamentation and grieving is really crucial to a lot of the Greek terminology. And I could be mistaken in the Hebrew, but when I look at the meanings of the terms raham, and I look at the way it functions in the Old Testament, I don't see that as an attitude towards others that's based on lamenting or grieving. There's a great deal more what I would call a calmness to it.
Yes, true.
And that's why I think it's unfortunate that the translators of the Septuagint didn't have the term eusplagnia. It's really interesting because fortunately I've got the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, which is a wonderful piece of digital researching. But if you look at eusplagnia, it has hardly any occurrences in Greek or Hellenic Judaism before roughly the Testament of the 12 Prophets and the Synoptic Gospels. And they're roughly synchronous with one another. And from what I've read in the Testament of the 12 Prophets, it's not clear whether the Testament of Zebulun, which is largely it's a paraphrase of the Good Samaritan parable in many ways. It's a takeoff on it. But whether it's influenced by the New Testament, whether the New Testament is influenced by it, whether there's two parallel tracks, but this language of eusplagnia comes up in a way that I think if that had been available to translate raham, it would have made much more sense of, I think, conveying at least how I understand the experience of compassion as the expression of it in the Old Testament, whereas the Greek tradition, it's just loaded into the systems of tragedies and lamentation, and a lot of it ultimately is very self-aggrandizing. But eleos does double duty.
Yeah.
And when you look at the translations of the early church fathers and the post-Nicene and early Nicene, including people like Philo the Jew, eleos is always mercy. But the verb eleao, it becomes it's always used to find pity. But remember, these were done in the 19th century where pity and compassion are largely synonymous with one another. So you go through the old library of the Nicene Fathers, pity is used all the time, and then you've got to scratch your head and wonder, are they talking about pity in a modern sense? Because if you look at the 4th century, if you look at John Chrysostom and Basil the Great, when they're trying to move the congregations to a sense of Christian charity, they're largely talking to elites who can't even be there. I mean, it's Ebenezer Scrooge in spades. They're trying to get people who are unwilling to give anything, even to lepers, to be able to give something. And the motivations for giving are ultimately matters of self-gain, right? Well, if you give, you'll wash away your sins. If you give, well, these guys will be grateful. They'll pray for you. If you give, if you can't give to them, we'll give to Jesus, because if you give to Jesus, well, they just sort of drop out of the picture. There are all these self-aggrandizing tropes that come in to motivate people to give, and you look at that and you think, that's not compassion. That's pity. And I think what happens is the language of pity ends up getting intermingled in the Byzantine text with the tradition coming out of the Old Testament. And the two get conflicted, so that when you read a lot of the New Testament text of Chrysostom, it's not clear analytically. Are they just trying to describe compassion or pity? And there are different strains using the same vocabulary. At least I would suggest making these distinctions. It leads you not to take the text at face value. And a lot of the texts that I think are ultimately self-aggrandizing appeals fit too much into Christian appeals to charity that I think mistake what's going on. Again, I don't know the rabbinical or the Hebrew tradition that well, but I would be surprised if those same traditions come out of the Hebrew. That's just my own humble opinion.
In Hebrew, you have tzedakah, which is something totally different, which means justice. On the contrary, it's really what you describe as compassion. Is really we are on the same level. It's very, very interesting, and it's divine also. It's like what I asked before. That guy is a divine power. It's not for any gain.
So now we have Ryan.
He already answered my question.
Okay.
He did. So good.
So
I have nothing to say.
great. Suri, so it's your turn.
Thank you first of all for the wonderful paper. Regarding what you say about the meaning of the term "chesed," the mercy, there is a prayer in Hebrew. It's called El Maleh Rachamim. It's merciful God. It's a prayer that we used to say for the soul of a person who died, and usually recited in the graveside during the burial or in memorial services. And when I've heard your paper, I recalled a very nice poem written by a famous poet from Jerusalem, passed away about 17 years ago. His name was Yehuda Amichai, and it's written as follows: God full of mercy. If God were not so full of mercy, there would be mercy in the world, not just in Him. And I think that this is what you are looking for. I mean, this is, as far as I understand, I just wanted to see if I understood it. You meant that there is a dissonance because of the fact we are human beings and we will never be divine. So we will never be able to have the compassion and the mercy and all what is between them. Am I right?
Yeah. We can reflect it. We can take it on and imitate it in a human way, but we never experience the fullness of it.
Because it's a divine character.
Because it's a divine characteristic. But on the other hand, and I think this is going to get to a question of dialogue, often compassion and mercy seem to be interlinked with others.
Yeah.
The problem is mercy seems to be something that is supererogatory, right? If I extend mercy to you, I'm giving you something which you're not entitled to. And if you take sort of a libertarian reading of this as a Christian tradition, then in showing mercy, we're really not giving anything to people that's due to them. We're simply going over and beyond any notion of duty. So compassion goes beyond any sense of obligations or justice. But the problem is, it may be that for God, compassion and mercy are identical because God doesn't owe us anything. We have no claims to make against God. But it doesn't follow that with respect to one another, we have no claims to make to one another. So that if you look at some of the texts, for example, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, about the Samaritan who's moved with compassion, well, that's an example of what it is to be a neighbor, to follow a command of the Lord, to love your neighbor as yourself. And Chrysostom says in one place, it's a really interesting text, he said, somebody who comes to you does absolutely nothing. When they come before you, you don't make any judgments about them. You support them because they make a just claim on you. And there is this notion in the patristic tradition that the compassion that we show to others, in fact, is something in a sense that we owe to other people. It's not just purely a supererogatory act. So I think one of the differences between divine compassion and our compassion is Divine compassion may be ultimately gratuitous towards us because we have no claims. In interhuman relationships, it doesn't follow that our compassion towards others is not reflective of lack of claims that other people have on us. It may be that there are claims and we respond to meet those claims. So that compassion and justice, again, can become allied with us in a way that's a little bit different.
Thank you.
If I could just make an observation getting back to the dialogue, part of the reason I sort of focused on this, going fishing may not seem much to have to do with dialogue, but I grew up as a Missouri Synod Lutheran, fundamentalist version of the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church back in the 50s. When I was a little kid, about, I guess, 6th, 7th grade, 8th or 9th grade, I was really proud to be a Lutheran. And I used to go to Bible school during the summer. Well, one summer we couldn't make it. So I went to the local Baptist school. And I was having a good time, and we were doing something there. And one of the little kids was sitting there, and he said, you don't go to this church, do you? And I said, no, I go to Bethany Lutheran Church. And he looked at me, and this was the great moment for me for religious tolerance, and you'll forget the language. He says, oh, you're one of those son of a bitchin' Lutherans. This out of the mouth of another 8th grader. And I thought, something's wrong with this picture. But what I learned there at a really early age are the visceral responses that can contaminate religious dialogue. And as I've gotten older, those same visceral responses dominate a lot of secular discussion. I mean, there are a lot of people that I encounter in a university who, it's just below the surface. You can see this animosity and this hostility towards anything having to do with the spiritual life. So what I'm talking about here isn't just people who have faith who need to attend to the passions that misguide them. There are a lot of people on the side who have no faith commitments at all, that bristle, that constrict, that draw in within themselves when there's any mention of a dialogue with faith. They close it off the closure goes on both sides. So my sense is a lot of dialogue at an academic level really gets thwarted from getting into depths because people have so many guards around them. The conversation has to remain at a fairly superficial level because people are, I think Seraphim is right, people are not willing to look at the things that threaten them and to really deal with those things and to open up and to allow the possibility that they might be wrong. Right?
Just a short question, maybe it sounds crazy, but I think that according to what you described, a person can feel compassion to God and he will be justified because he does not have to experience God, but he says something that God tells him needs, I say, not empathy is the wrong word, but something is wrong, but I will not judge God now because I have compassion for God. Why do I say that? Because you asked me before about the word for compassion. I thought it's tzedakah.
Mm-hmm.
And it says on Abraham, very famous, very difficult verse, that when he trusted God, when he promised him that he'll have children, so he says, God considered it tzedakah. And it may mean that Abraham had compassion to God. What would you say about something like this?
I'm not quite sure. I could transpose it into a Christian idiom, but it's going to look a little bit different. In the Christian idiom, the incarnation, right? When the Son of God takes flesh with its humility. The whole event of the incarnation is divine hospitality. Okay? It's an act of this invitation. It's a version of Abraham's hospitality, right? Sort of God comes to the edge, enters human history, invites us back in, but invites us back in from a point of utter dependency, okay? And invites us to be compassionate to Him. So that in the Christian tradition, the way we show compassion to God is compassion to the one who takes flesh. That's different, I think, from what you're talking about.
Yes.
But it does show up in that tradition. So But could you help me a little bit more understand what you were saying about Abraham?
People without being pretentious enough to judge God, we judge God the whole time. Because God makes promises, and the question is, when He does not fulfill His promises, we say, you owe me, you promised me, you owe me. Feeling compassion towards God, I think, means you didn't fulfill your promises. You didn't fulfill your promises. I asked when before, if God is good or not. And if He shows Himself in the Holocaust, people ask, is God good? And if yes, how did He allow the Holocaust to happen? If someone has compassion to God, we can understand that God is good and He's just, and I can never experience what God experienced, but I don't judge Him. And the thing of not judging but having compassion, maybe God needs that's it. He asked for compassion, not as subjects to God. We still have to feel compassion to God.
If you mean by that this non-judgmental openness to, that doesn't close God off, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, we gain time, so.
Miracle.